Okay, I'm here with Sarah Drasner. We're live at Smashing Conf, so there's probably some sound in the background, but yeah, what can you do? You haven't given your talk here yet, but you're going to talk, I guess, about animation, because that's something that drives you, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, I'll be speaking about innovative SVG animations.
Okay. SVG seems to be this weird, it used to be a poster child of what can be possible with the web, and then it fell asleep for a few years because people didn't like the XML syntax, and then it became something that is usable again. What do you think was the main driver there? What made it really useful for people again?
Well, I think we were trying to solve a lot of things, a lot of issues that with a few other technologies, like we were using font icons in order to kind of create these like glyphs, and that was kind of hacky. I mean, I definitely did that, but then you're positioning with text and lettering what you should be positioning with images. So I think what ended up happening was, number one, responsive became a big deal, and so having something that scaled to all devices and was very easily scalable was a huge deal, especially the fact that it was resolution independent, and then you have these devices with different resolution densities. It's still crisp. Was pretty big. So responsive was a giant part of it. I think another part of it was dev advocacy. I think Sarah Swedon and Chris Coyer did a lot of work kind of, annihilating some of the misconceptions about SVG and digging in there and really explaining some of the details that made it look kind of hard, that it wasn't so hard. So I think it was a few things like that in general, and then the death of Flash was definitely a big one, because you now have things in SVG animation that you can do that are comparable or better, I would say, than Flash used to be. So then, that's kind of like a 1-2 punch that really created a fever pitch around SVG's adoption.
The problem that I have with SVG and where Flash was absolutely winning was the tooling. That you can use Inkscape, you can use Illustrator to do native static SVG, but the animation of SVG using proper tooling like timelines and stuff, there seems to be no tools out there yet.
Well, I don't think so. I think there's actually tons and tons of tools, especially if you know JavaScript. I think even if you aren't that familiar with JavaScript, the syntax for some of the kind of GSAP things are not that complicated. Some of the React Motion things for React devs is really very declarative and similar to coding in React. So these types of iteration tooling, it really digs into the way that devs are kind of used to working, and I feel pretty comfortable prototyping even in JavaScript, just like the way that other people used to with Flash animations. But for people who are not so technically astute, there are tools that compile down to full SVG animations, like body movement is something that I don't use very much because I like coding, but other people, you can make a full thing in After Effects and it exports to SVG animation. And then there's also an in-between that was what Flash used to look like. There's a kind of GUI that plugs into GSAP that you can play with timelines in the same way that we used to have that Flash interface. So I would say that anything that you want to do is probably out there in the open source world.
In terms of the syntax itself, when you show somebody a green sock animation or something, it seems to make a lot of sense. If you show somebody the source code of an SVG file, it gets rather complex, doesn't it? I
actually don't think it. I think it's one of those things that has it has a base learning, you look at it and it looks really complicated, but what I've noticed in the workshops that I give is that just even a half an hour of being this is this, it works like this, you can break it down really fast and in a half an hour know everything in the SVG DOM and totally be able to work with it and manipulate it. And the cool thing about making graphics with math is that you can make so many things happen with touch, with interaction, with sound, and have them all interact in a really intuitive way. And the fact that it's scalable is also really nice. I'll be showing a demo later today for a video game that I made where I had a heart meter that shows your score, and you can kind of update that state of the score and have it update the rect because rects are actually pretty simple. They're just like an x coordinate, a y coordinate for where they begin, and then the width and the height, and it just plots a rectangle. So some of these things that look kind of complicated when you first see them, when you see somebody being able to manipulate them, and I do kind of go into the DOM and manipulate it, live coding thing, it kind of like opens up the world of possibilities of what you can do. And that's why it's good for data visualization too.
It's kind of the same. I mean, it seems to me that people are very easy in getting around the coordinate system. Like, okay, here's 0, 0, here's 100, 100, 200, 200. And I had the same when I explained Canvas to people. And then I started explaining to them that the coordinate system in Canvas is actually stateful. So you can save it and you can restore it and you can zoom it and turn it and rotate it. And out of a sudden, it became very complex for people. It's like that thinking of from 2D to 2D and rotation and multiplication of coordinates seems to be something that is very confusing to people on first glance.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I guess in SVG, the box model in SVG itself, it has the same problem, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, I think what you're getting used to is a different set of rules, right? Like that, the fact that you can have a coordinate system that works a certain way, and that you can just completely change the size of it and the coordinate system stays the same, is something that trips people up when they're trying to like plot, E client X or something like that. But really, one of the cool things about it is that if you make an SVG animation along this coordinate system, you can scale that animation and it will stay true to form. It won't like break and jump out of bounds and things like that. So it's a trade-off, I would say, in understanding like how it's collapsible in that way, but it stays stable, which is really, really nice. But yeah, just like anything else, I think there's like certain parts of it that when you dig into it, like the preserve aspect ratio and all of its things can be really confusing to people. I use it very little. Like that's one thing that like trips people up and they think they need to know it in order to work with SVG. And I think it's useful. I definitely crop on the fly with it, but I would say that I've used it in like 1 out of 100 projects or something. So yeah, I think teaching people the parts that they need to know in order to work with it first, and then digging into some of the details that like is good for them to know, but like maybe they could survive on defaults.
What about prejudices? I mean, one of them is that SVG is always slow and very memory intensive. Is that still the case? Or
no, not at all. I mean, a lot of the SVG animations that I show at these conferences, or if you go to my CodePen and see tons of SVG animations there, most of them are around 10 kilobytes gzipped, which is crazy. So they can load over any connection. They're very good for mobile. Being able to make an SVG and animate it and have it be so good on all of these resolutions for 10 kilobytes is something that even like bitmaps cannot do, and is kind of one of the more exciting parts of it. So that is something that I work on. It's a discrimination, yes, that I try to work on abolishing as I speak at these conferences, to say like, like you can do tons of stuff more than even like a static image with so little amount of information. But I would say that the other side of that is that you do have to design for performance. Like I've definitely had people hand me giant graphics that aren't really suitable for SVG. You do have to think critically about it.
There seems to be a preset problem, like for example, Jake Archibald did this OMG SVG optimizer that when you save something out of Illustrator, it's huge and there's lots of data in it that you don't need. Mind you, we have the same with JPEGs and other things saved out of Photoshop with like lots of EXIF data in there. But do you think that with more people using XML and relying on it, that our tooling would get better in exporting them as well? I remember the first Photoshop I used didn't have a JPEG exporter. It was like ULEAD Smart Safer or something like that. Yeah,
actually, we're already doing that. So in Illustrator, if you use Save As, it's terrible. Don't do that. But if you use Export As, it is actually really good settings. You probably could get away with it without doing SVG OMG, but I still do that anyway. But basically, Dmitry Baranovsky, who is the person who did You Don't Know SVG and Raphael SVG, the person responsible for that, works at Adobe, and he redid all of the new export settings with a team, of course. So they're really good now in Illustrator. I would say Sketch's export settings really are not great. And I hope you're watching this, Bohemian Coding. Go work on your SVG export tools. I have found myself cutting and pasting from Sketch over to Illustrator just because their export settings are like that much better. There's also stuff that you can do. I wrote an article on CSS tricks called High Performance SVGs that basically talks just about how you can make a complex graphic that a designer hands you become really performant for the web. And kind of digs into all of the path simplification things you can do. So if just the export settings don't suit you, there are ways of working with SVG that in the process of building with it, just like designing for performance for any part of a website, the more you're educated about how these things work, then you can actually make SVGs that are super performant.
It feels to me, though, that we're still in a kind of a war about animation formats and animation things. There's SVG, of course. There used to be Smile, which I only ever used in Real Player, really. And then there is now the Web Animation API, and all of them, and of course the GreenSock people have been put a lot of information into the animation API. And whenever you talked about CSS animations, they were the first ones to say like, oh, it's not good enough. So, I mean, as a developer, I don't want to concentrate on three things. I just like, do you think it makes sense if different people specialize themselves on different APIs and then you partner with them and you should just have a basic knowledge, or what would you say is concentrating on worthwhile? I
mean, I'm a naturally curious person, so I play with all of them. And while I play with all of them, I note what things are good at and what they are not so good at, and I try to do that kind of breakdown in the talks. I would say GreenSock is just really good. I mean, they've been at it since the Flash days, right? So GreenSock was a Flash tool originally, and they've been working on this as long as Smashing has had conferences, so 10 years. There's just so many plugins. There's so many things that you can make and build with their tools. I don't work for them. They don't pay me. I just really like them. There's other tools that are good at other things. Like React Motion is very good at game-based animation, where GreenSock is like sequential timing, where you're like thinking very iteratively about like what moves where, and you get this like finite control. React Motion is a little bit more like you give something mass and physics and send it on its way. And that makes for really beautiful interruptible animations that you're kind of used to with mobile, like something being able to move around your screen as you're touching it and collapsing and things like that. But it's hard to control if you're doing something really finite. So I would say, and Web Animations API is super awesome, and it looks to be like a brilliant native solution, but right now it's moving a lot and the spec is changing, and even with a polyfill you could stand to have things break in production. If you had to pick one at this moment that would be worth your time and investment, I would say GreenSock.
I had a Twitter back and forth with Brad Frost, a good friend of mine. So it was good to actually just talk about it. And he said like, okay, I want to use inline SVG. No, not inline SVG. I want to point to an SVG in an image file, and it was on another server, so browsers didn't allow him because of cross-origin problems. And I explained the security issues. I explained inlining them or caching them locally would work around these issues. And his answer was like, well, I don't want to hack the Pentagon. I only want to put like 6-pixel images on my page.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that developers have to get used to the fact that it's a different image format, right? So, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's okay, go on.
So, like, what you used to do with fonts, you're not going to do with SVG. I think inlining makes a lot of sense, especially using symbol defs. And then, we all work with like PHP or Ruby or, JavaScript to concatenate multiple files together. You keep that in either the top of your file or another file, and then you reference it. Inline has the best support and is really great for if you want to change color and animation. It just is the most extensible solution. You don't have to worry about cross-origin thing. You're also saving yourself an HTTP request. So I don't really see the downside to using them inline. But yeah, I think it will probably be tough for people to get used to some things about it. But there are some things about what we were doing there that didn't make any sense, right? Like using an external file and then defining the width and height of something that the browser should know the width and height of, because it is seeing it as a different kind of image, wouldn't make sense if you were used to it the other way. So, I think some of this stuff is just getting used to something new when something else is getting replaced. And stuff.
Do you think part of the controversy is that SVG lives in that uncanny valley between development and design?
Yes, I definitely do. I think actually probably the reason why you have advocates that are kind of like me or Chris or something is because both of us do both. And it's a very comfortable space for us where it might be a little bit less comfortable for other people. I do think that I've acted like a designer for them and not the developer, and more often been the developer and not the designer enough to know that that does work too. That you just have to, it's just like any other design and dev process, where you have to know certain things on either side. Like the illustrator who's dealing with the SVG would have to know much more about don't make a million path points than the developer should have to learn, right? And then the developer has to know more about what inline style, like what inline SVG will offer over something else and that kind of stuff. And they don't really need to know both. They need to know the part that suits them.
So if there's one thing that you want people to stop talking about when it comes to SVG, which is the one like killer argument that people always bring up that brings your blood to boil and say like that hasn't been true for years and years and people keep bringing it up. Is there something out there that people keep telling?
Yeah, I think I was surprised when working at big companies or being a consultant for big companies that the common developer still thinks that they're not supported. Like if you go to Can I Use and write SVG in, it's all great. And I think that there's still this idea that they're not well supported, that there's giant problems with them. There are small problems with SVG here and there, not more than any other web technology. But they are really well supported. So if I had a blowhorn where I could speak to every dev right now very easily, which I don't, then I would definitely say that one thing.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Christian.